All right, let's take a look at some case studies here. And so these are going to be real examples. They're the first paragraphs of actual real abstracts that I reviewed, actually not this semester, that's anachronistic. This was a couple of years ago. For the Linguistic Society of America annual meeting, we looked at their abstract requirements earlier. And so these are the first paragraphs of a bunch of those abstracts. Where really you want to get a good chunk of the work of the abstract done in that first paragraph. Because you don't have that much space here. So for each of these, I'll ask you to read them and think briefly about how well they did on several different points. So first, can you reconstruct from this first paragraph what's going to be the main contribution of this talk? Why would I want to hear this? What's the problem it's solving? And is there at least a hint of what the solution is going to be like? Now, for some of these, maybe the solution is going to be described in more detail in the next paragraph, but are we at least getting some idea of what the problem is that you're trying to solve and how you're going to try to solve it? Did you explain clearly the background? Which parts of this introduction look really nice, and what are the problems with it? Now, the general sort of heuristic here for the LSA, this particular conference, you can assume that if you're submitting a phonology abstract, it's going to be reviewed by somebody who's a phonologist. So these are all abstracts that were passed on to me. I've listed my expertise as basically phonetics and phonology. So you can assume that I'm going to be familiar with some sort of basic terminology and concepts in the field, but you can't assume that I know anything about your specific topic, right? So you need at least that level of clarification. With that in mind, let's take a look at some of these. And this is going to be independently of whether you understand all of the technical terminology in these abstracts. It's still possible to get an understanding of whether these are effectively introducing their topics, setting up a problem, and explaining what their work is about, whether or not they're giving a super specific explanation of their solution. So let's think about this briefly. Here's number one. This is about sign languages and certain kinds of signs and signed languages. Is this going to be big enough to be read? Yeah, it looks like it will be. Okay. So take a moment, read this, and try to answer those questions. What's the main contribution here? What's good about this introductory paragraph? And what needs work? Okay, well, here's my answer. I think this is a great first paragraph. They do a really good job laying out the background here for people who might know something about phonology or about sign languages, but are not necessarily deeply engaged with the details here. So they're explaining what these two-touch or double contact signs are all about. This is the general topic here. This is how they work, explained in plain language that anybody can understand. They don't explain what ASL is. This is American Sign Language. Hopefully people know enough about sign language to know that, although maybe it would have been worth writing in the full phrase. There's a little bit of like what I call reference soup in here. And, you know, in a paper, it might make sense to sort of rigorously cite everything connected to this. But in a conference abstract, this might be a bit of overkill. You don't necessarily want to use your space on lots of references to previous work. Maybe one would have been enough. So they're going to be giving you some figures that illustrate each of these. That's an excellent idea. This is a sort of strange point. They've redacted some particular words in the sentence because they're citing their own work, and they don't want to give away who they are. They're taking the anonymization requirement seriously. This is one way of doing that. And they're referring to themselves here. I've identified these signs that share some but not all properties with such double contact signs. Right there, I would say that's a statement of the research problem. So I have all of these descriptions of signs that kind of look like they belong in this category, but there's actually all sorts of other interesting things about these signs. How am I going to solve that? Well, here is a brief hint of what my theory is like of these signs. I'm going to give them this name. That's established in the previous literature. And then I'm going to show that there's a problem here, that there's previously existing theories of sign language phonology can't really describe how these work. Therefore, I'm going to give a solution in this broad class of solutions, and I'll give you some words here that might hint at what I'm getting at if you know something about the relevant literature. Otherwise, presumably the next paragraph is going to have more detail on how this works, right? I would say this is a fantastic first paragraph of an abstract. So what's the verdict? This one was accepted for a talk. So the most prestigious result is to be accepted for a talk. Being accepted for a poster is also pretty good. This one was a really excellent abstract. All right, here's the first paragraph of another one that was sent to me. What do you think about this one? Okay, there are some problems here. First of all, this title is a very long title with a lot of technical terminology in it. Probably could have been maybe simplified a little bit more. We start right out with naming two different kinds of technical phonological theories of different sound contrasts and computational capacities for dealing with sound patterns. And we're given a raft of references to previous literature that we're almost surely not going to read because we're trying to review this abstract quickly. It probably would have been much more effective to just have a sentence about what dispersion theory is and what contour correspondence theory is. Now, I'm an accomplished phonologist. I happen to know what both of these theories refer to, but probably would have been useful to put that information in. What is this research indicating? The slope of tonal and non-tonal contours plays an important role in preserving phonological contrast, especially tonal contours and vowel harmony. This is a very long first sentence. There's a lot of content in here. It's describing some highly technical ideas that are difficult to wrap your head around. And this probably should have been significantly expanded, right? So even as somebody who really works in this narrow area, I have a good understanding of what both of these theories are. I've read most of these papers. Two of these people are my dissertation advisors. I'm not sure what this abstract is talking about, right? So the slope of tonal and non-tonal contours is going to be a highly technical phonetic concept. I don't know what he's referring to, or sorry, I'm making assumptions about the gender. I don't know what they're referring to here, because you could be talking about the slope of a number of different things. The slope of the fundamental frequency, the slope of formant frequencies, the slope of intensity. You're talking about something changing over time, but you haven't said what. And you're saying that they play an important role in preserving phonological contrasts, but then these two things that you've referred to after that, these are not phonological contrasts, these are phonological objects. So I'm not sure what it would mean to preserve phonological contrasts that are tonal contours or phonological contrasts that are vowel harmony. That's the name of a process. So I am now one sentence in, and I know this literature, but I have no idea what this person is talking about. Following these findings, where we don't understand what the findings are, well, this person is telling you what their solution is. Contours that share the same slope should be less likely to co-occur to preserve the tonal contrast between lexical tones in one language. I broadly understand what that's saying, but you haven't set out a problem to be solved. You're telling me the solution to a problem that you haven't introduced. So I still have no idea what this talk is actually about or what the contribution is. This is a pretty poorly written first couple sentences of an abstract. And, you know, this person probably should have had somebody take a look at this before they sent it into the conference. This is almost impossible to understand. I have lots of background in these theories, but other people reviewing this probably don't even have that. And so they might not even know what contour correspondence refers to. It's a very specific phonological theory. So, yeah, what do you think happened with this? It was rejected. All right, next up. Here is one about a sort of narrow phonetic topic that has to do with characteristics of a speaker that listeners sort of infer from the sounds of their speech. What do we think about this one? Well, I would say this one's pretty good. So we start out with the sentence, the perception of apparent talker height from speech. That's stated in plain English. I understand what that means. It's usually modeled as a function of these two phonetic properties, which, you know, I've been sent this abstract, so presumably I know what fundamental frequency and formant frequencies are. And so that's sort of the basic topic. And, you know, I actually didn't know this. I didn't know anything about how people infer things about the size of a talker from listening to their speech. I mean, I probably could have guessed some stuff, but I've never read this research. However, I now understand what they're talking about. It makes sense to me that these properties would be related to apparent talker height. Now you're going to tell me what the problem is. However, well, there's evidence that beyond just these general phonetic frequencies, that this interacts with specific sounds in a language, even when they're produced by a single talker. So in a sense, there must be more going on here than just measuring these acoustic properties. And that second part, really explicitly stating the problem, isn't quite done here. So maybe that could have been stated a little bit more clearly, that this is an issue, something that our theory is going to need to deal with. Here is a reference to a paper that takes on these sound-specific or phoneme-specific effects. And so maybe this is going to be approached to solving some of the problems. And it's related to sound symbolism, which is now a completely separate topic. And I'm going to give you a little tiny bit of background on how sound symbolism works. This is where certain kinds of words or certain kinds of sounds are more likely to be associated with some kinds of meanings than they are with other kinds of meanings. There's a famous experiment that everybody universally refers to in this area as the boo-boo kiki experiment, where across a huge variety of unrelated languages, if you give somebody a round blob-like shape and a sharp pointy kind of shape and ask them which one of these shapes is boo-boo and which one of them is kiki, almost universally, speakers of any language will tell you that the soft and curvy one is boo-boo and the sharp and pointy one is kiki. That's sound symbolism. And they're basically explaining, if not those specific results, they're sort of giving a vague idea of what that sound symbolism is. Here it's going to be related to size rather than shape. And then there's also some relevant background that in this specific language I'm going to be talking about, this specific phonological property also has an effect on these perceptions, and it works the following way. So lots of good background here. They're doing a good job. This is a pretty peripheral or not very well-known topic, and so they really need to introduce all of the relevant background here as quickly as possible. I think they've done a nice job with that. They maybe could have laid out a little bit more clearly or more specifically what the problem is that they're trying to address. We've sort of gotten lost in all of the background here, and we're not sure what the talk is going to be about yet, except from the title. So maybe they could have started out with a sentence explaining what they're going to propose and then go into the background. But I don't know, overall this seems pretty good to me, right? So what happened with this one? Accepted for a poster. So not the most prestigious category of acceptance, but pretty good result, pretty well written first paragraph, lots of technical information to get through here. I think they've done a good job with it. Here's one more. Take a look at this one. This is about a sound pattern in a particular variety of Sardinian. Okay, so we're looking at this. Do we know what the contribution is? Well, yeah, so at the end here of the first paragraph, there's a little bit of a discussion. We're going to present some acoustic data from fieldwork with these speakers of this language, and we're going to show you some generalizations about the general topic here that go beyond what I've talked about earlier. And here's the kind of solution or the kind of analysis that I'm going to propose. And of course, there's not a ton of detail about this, but maybe this person will go into it a little bit more in the next paragraph. Laying out the background here, this is good. We have a reference. There's an unusual lenition pattern. This is a technical term in phonology. Again, if I was sent this abstract, probably I know what lenition refers to. Just in case, I'm going to describe what that process looks like. Oh, I just gave this away. This one is different from the other abstracts because this one was written by me and submitted. And the point here is not that I write wonderful abstracts. The point is that, my abstracts suffer from the same problems and issues that everybody else's do. So in class, I like to present this and have people critique it and then reveal that I actually wrote it. In any case, this is my abstract. And so I'm going to tell you what I'm talking about in terms of lenition and then show the examples down here. What's the problem? Well, it's problematic for phonological theory because it has these formal properties, and this is an issue. So lots of phonologists have worked on this. This is maybe more background than you need. I guess this is part of the problem, is that people have accepted this description at face value and have come up with all sorts of crazy theories about how it works. But first part of my solution here, there's a whole other literature that actually makes this look really different than it was described in this one work. And I'm going to show you how this works in more detailed phonetic terms, and hopefully that will allow us to get a little bit of a grip on this problem. So overall, I'd say all the components are here. This is a very long first paragraph, and it has tons of literature references and technical concepts in it. Maybe this could have been broken up a little bit more effectively. Yeah, or possibly some of this background could have been taken out. Maybe all of these references don't need to be in here. When I'm referring to this stuff, these are specific theoretical accounts of a specific sound pattern. Probably people, unless they happen to have read these papers, might not even know what I'm talking about here. This term saltatory alternation is not a common term in phonology, and so just stating that might not even be meaningful to people reading this. That said, I think, all the components here are broadly present, and it gives you an idea of what kind of a talk this is going to be, what the contribution might be. So what happened with this one? I got accepted for a poster presentation. So that's a pretty good outcome. I was happy with that. And yeah, the point here is that, it's easy for me to sit here and talk about all the different things you should be doing when you write an abstract, but writing abstracts is hard, right? And the ones that I send into conferences are far from perfect. It's something we struggle with and we work to get better with. Okay. There's a couple very short and minor points here, so I'm not going to split this out in a separate video. I will just go through these quickly. This is an important point. If you're not a native speaker of the language in which you're writing the abstract, you really need to get help from a native speaker to check it over carefully before submission, and make sure that the person you ask is not going to be too polite, right? You don't want these people to tell you that it's yeah, that sounds great, unless it really is. So out of the ones we just looked at, I think the one that got rejected about the contour tones had a whole bunch of problems, but among others, there were some unusual sort of usage patterns there, or word choice patterns, that suggest to me that probably that person was not a native English speaker, and probably nobody proofread that before they sent it in. And it really should have been proofread, because in addition to whatever minor grammatical issues there may have been in that abstract, probably the person proofreading it would have also said, I have no idea what you're talking about. You need to clarify this, right? And that would have been helpful to the person who sent that abstract in. Finally, and most importantly, give yourself enough time when writing your abstract to allow the finished draft to be put aside for several days. When you return to it, read it over carefully and see if it all still makes sense. And this is really useful advice. I try to do this as much as possible anytime I write anything. Because when you're in the heat of the moment, you're fully engulfed in these ideas, and you've been thinking about them possibly for hours or days or months at this point, and you know the intricate structure of what you're doing in each sentence here. But when you get absorbed in those details too much, you can sometimes sort of lose sight of what it actually looks like as a text. Taking a day or two to set it aside and then coming back to it with fresh eyes often will really change the way you're thinking about the abstract. And this is a useful thing to do because it's in some sense closer to what the reviewer is going to see than your initial view might have been when you're still totally absorbed in the details of the abstract itself. Let it rest, let it parts of it leave your memory, then come back and take another look. See if it makes sense as an entire text. Like, read it as if it were somebody else's writing. This is really good advice. So the upshot here. Conferences are a great way to develop your knowledge, your network of professional contacts, your presentation skills, and they're usually pretty fun also. I suggest that everybody who is in the MA program here should try going to a conference at least once. It's extra easy these days because they're mostly on Zoom. You don't even have to go anywhere. And so it's worth checking out a conference. Whether or not you're going to present, you can just go as a spectator too, and that's often very useful as well. You won't quite get the opportunity to meet people or to talk about work in a Zoom format that you might at a real-life conference, but it could still be really useful and fun. That said, if you want to present, writing a good abstract is really hard. And sometimes presenting at a conference can be very intimidating, although, get help finding a good conference that won't be too intimidating. You have lots of resources here to help you. There are a bunch of options for students who might be intimidated by the process. You can just go to the conference without presenting. That's definitely a possibility. You can pick a good starter conference to submit to. So the one that we found earlier when we were looking at announcements was specifically a graduate student conference. That's a great idea. So conferences specifically intended for students are going to have much more of a helpful collaborative workshop kind of a feel. That's generally going to be the case if you find a smaller regional or local conference. This is not quite as high stakes. It's likely to be more of a supportive environment where maybe people are also looking to make connections locally with people who might be close to them geographically, who they can talk to about their work. And then also the word workshop itself is a pretty good signifier that this is likely to be more of a collaborative workshop style meeting, where rather than like an audience sitting in a conference hall picking apart somebody's talk, this is likely to be a group of like-minded people who are working on similar specific topics and who are having a collaborative and supportive environment. Also, ask your professors. They might know about what kinds of conferences are like what. And definitely consider going to one or more conferences while you're a student here, if especially hopefully later next year, we'll be back to face-to-face conferences, and this can be a really, really fun thing to do. So I recommend it to everybody.